In 1980, the National Academy of Science had published a first major study on the possibility that we were moving into a climate change event. I wrote a book at that time, Entropy, and I introduced some discussion on climate change and what it might mean for society. And during the 1980s, I became more and more active on the emerging climate change debate. In the late 80s, we put together the first global coalition of NGOs, meteorologists, and climatologists from all over the world, and we began to work together, both theory and practice, science and activism, to move this issue of climate change onto the global center stage. And during this entire time, there was a lot of discussion about the contribution to climate change from buildings and from industrial factories and from transportation and logistics. We all knew that these were major players in contributing to climate change. But I became aware during that same period of time that there was another factor that was going undiscussed, and that is the role of cattle and livestock animal husbandry and agriculture, which I could see was playing some significant role in climate change and global warming around the planet. But this was the elephant in the room no one wanted to talk about. Total silence. And this is what led me to finally write the book Beyond Beef, which came out in 1992. I should say it was quite controversial at the time. Not a single environmental organization on the national level in the United States would endorse the book or review the book or discuss the book. In fact, one senior environmental scientist at one of the major environmental organizations provided a nice quotation for the book, and his organization said that if there was any furthermore conversation on this matter, his job would be in jeopardy. The environmental movement didn't want to talk about it, and I should say some of the environmental leaders who are well known, global environmental spokespersons, would never touch the issue for fear that it would offend people's dietary habits, and so they just left it unsaid. So the book was put out, very controversial. The cattle industry, the beef industry, the livestock industry went ballistic all over the country. There were some security issues involved, but we created a Beyond Beef campaign saying it's time to take a look at the role that cattle and livestock play in global warming. And let me be clear about what that role is. There's 1.5 billion cows on this planet. They take up 26% of all the available land mass on Earth. And if you were coming from another part of the universe and you landed here, you might think they were the dominant species. They take up a lot of the space. I love cows. My wife and I are engaged in animal protection, animal rights issues. But we need to understand the role that cattle and livestock play in climate change. Cattle emit methane and nitrous oxide. Now, most people, when they think of climate change, they think of CO2, carbon dioxide, which is a very potent global warming gas. But methane is 25 times more potent per molecule when it's released than CO2. And nitrous oxide is 298 times more potent per molecule than CO2. These are very powerful global warming gases. So when cows emit methane, people might think that's funny and not important, but it is a major contributor to climate change. And their manure, nitrous oxide is emitted from that manure. So when you put those combinations together, we began to see the role they play. In fact, cattle and livestock industry plays a more important role in global warming than transportation. We spend a lot of time on transportation and automobiles and what we ought to do to transform our transportation logistics system, and still no word about agriculture, and especially livestock agriculture. Indeed, cattle and livestock play a more important role even than a lot of our building environment and our industrial activities. So what's very, very clear here is that there has been a global silence around a very important factor that will affect our future destiny on this planet, and that's the role that cattle and livestock play in global warming emissions. It's an emission that is so shocking that it's surprising to me that we haven't been able to open the door to a robust global debate. And I tested out myself. From the time we put out that book, Beyond Beef, in every lecture that I've done around the world, I've asked at a certain point during my lecture, I've said, look, we know that buildings are a major cause of global warming emissions, and electricity grids and power generation and factories that produce our goods and services and transport. And I said, does anybody know what the second most important contributor to global warming gas is? And early on, people had no idea. After about 5 or 10 years into the 1990s, and around 2000, I'd get one person maybe every 2 lectures. Right now, I get about 5% of the audience knows. So it takes a long time for this to get onto the radar screen. Well, it's part of the culture. It's the ritual. We associate our cultures with our food. In fact, in America, for example, we are a beef culture. We're a cowboy culture. So any discussion whatsoever that we might have to move down the food chain and maybe forego some of a beef diet, the reaction is enormous. And that's what happened when the book came out. The beef industry, the reaction was catastrophic. And there was no one there on our side in the environmental movement. It took many, many years before the United Nations It took many years later when finally the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization did put out a major study confirming everything that I had said in Beyond Beef and in our Beyond Beef campaign, that cattle and livestock production and the whole supply chain that goes with that is a major, major player in climate change and has to be addressed. What's interesting, however, is that the FAO also projects that we're going to double meat production between now and in 2050. So this is, we're in a situation now, if we maintain silence on this, we're not going to be able to address climate change. It's as simple and profound as that. It'll be a catastrophe. There's another aspect to this that's worthy of discussion, and that is the food feed issue. It's very, very tied into climate change and the environmental consequences here. I think people will be surprised to know one of the great injustices in the world is what happened in agriculture in the 20th century when we moved from growing crops for food for people to growing crops for feed for animals. Before that time in history, animals pastured on grassland, all right? But beginning in the early part of the 20th century, there was surplus food, especially corn. We had a mechanical revolution in agriculture, then a chemical revolution in agriculture. We were producing lots of surplus, and we decided, well, we can produce more food than people need, so we should now be producing feed, and we can provide it to our animals rather than pasture on grass. That was one of the great turning points, actually, in history. Today, and this is going to surprise everyone listening to this, 36% of all the agricultural land in the world where we're growing crops is feed grain for animals, not food grain for people. I want to emphasize that. Over a third of all the cropland in this world today is growing feed grain for animals. And if we're going to double our meat consumption, as the FAO projects, it means that over half, well over half of our cropland in the world by 2050 is going to be feed grain for animals. And so that the very rich can eat high up on the food chain with a grain-fed diet. And the irony is then we die of diseases of affluence like heart attacks, strokes, obesity, diabetes. These are all related to a heavy beef diet. And the irony is, and it's a terrible irony, that the poor in the world will not have access to land for food at an affordable price to feed their family, and they die of diseases of undernutrition, malnutrition. We have 850 million people in the world today who are on the border of starvation every day. And it takes 7 to 9 pounds of grain to produce only 1 pound of beef. It's the most inefficient part of our global economy today. And if that same acre were put into vegetables and legumes, we could get 10 to 15 times more protein in production on vegetables and legumes per acre of land than giving it over to feed grain because the ratios are so astoundingly bad. And so, you know, I think the prosperous industrial world, we don't want to hear about this. Let me back up for a moment and talk about the future of our existence here on planet Earth. We are in real-time climate change. This is no longer a theory. It's not looming on the horizon. It's not imminent. Climate change is here in real time, and it's already affecting our species, our fellow creatures, and our ecosystems all over the world. What's terrifying about climate change, and what I'm about to describe is never described, because what I'm about to say, if everyone in the world knew this, we would have the entire human race motivated, driven, and on message to do nothing more, or, I'm sorry. What I'm about to describe is important. We really do not have an understanding of what the impact of climate change is. So what I'm about to describe, if everyone heard this message, we would not only be terrified, we would be driven and committed to save our species, our fellow creatures, and the ecosystems of this earth. Climate change changes the water cycles of the planet. No one's ever told this. We're the watery planet. We go out on our space odysseys, and we look for water on other planets, and if there's no water, we're not interested. Our ecosystems here on Earth have developed over millions of years based on the hydrosphere, the hydrological cycle, the way that the precipitation moves through the clouds across our ecosystems. Here's the rub. For every 1 degree that the temperature goes up on Earth because of industrial-induced global warming emissions, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, for every 1 degree that temperature is going up on this planet because of these global warming emissions, the atmosphere is sucking up 7% more precipitation from the ground. The heat that's being generated is forcing the precipitation into the clouds, so we're getting more concentrated precipitation in our clouds and more dramatic, extreme, and unpredictable water events all over the world. Blockbuster winter snows, 8 feet in Boston. That's now a new normal in some places. Massive flooding across the world on every continent in the spring, which is destroying our ecosystems, our infrastructures, and people's lives are being lost. We had floods in the Carolinas in the last few years, and they said, well, the first flood, they said, this happens once every 1,000 years, a flood of this magnitude. Now there's been several. We have summer drought, wildfires from droughts. From British Columbia to Santa Barbara, everything's on fire. This is happening everywhere because of the drought situations. People are losing their homes, ecosystems are being destroyed, our fellow species are losing their lives. We have Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes now. That hurricane that hit the Philippines a few years ago, they said it was the most powerful in history. That's the new normal. We had 4 of those hurricanes in the last season in the Caribbean, hitting our coastal areas from Texas to Florida. This is the new normal. And so our ecosystems cannot catch up to a runaway water cycle that's brought on by climate change. They're collapsing in real time. And this is what I want everyone to hear. If you're a young millennial starting a family, if you're a parent or a grandparent, you really need to hear this. Our scientists tell us we're now in the 6th extinction event of life on this earth. It doesn't even make the headlines. No one even knows about it. But it's the most dramatic story the human family's ever faced. We've had 5 mass extinction events on this planet in 450 million years, well before humans were here. We are now in the 6th extinction event. This is not a model. Our scientists are chronicling it in real time. And they're telling us that we could lose up to 50% of all of our major species in less than 8 decades from now. Let me be clear on this. The last time we had an extinction event of this magnitude was 65 million years ago. As my wife says, we are asleep. We're greenwashing. We have a lot of nice projects in the cities for LEED buildings and for hydrogen buses and for solar, platforms, but we are not making the kind of dramatic transformation we need to get there in time. So this should be a wake-up call. This generation, our children's generation, we are going to be in climate change for thousands of years. This is not going to be reversed. But the key is, how do we avoid the abyss? How do we make sure now we transform ourselves off of fossil fuels? We move into a new society where we move down the food chain dramatically to a plant-based diet. How do we begin to create resilience in each of our communities so we can have self-sustaining, more local and regional agriculture? These are all the kinds of inputs we need if we're going to actually wake up and take control of our future and begin to create a society that's resilient in a new era of unpredictable weather in the Anthropocene. It's clear we need a new economic vision for the world, and it has to be compelling, and we need a game plan to act on that vision quickly in every community, both in the developing world, the industrial world, and beginning with this generation, the next 3 generations, we have to be on mission to transform the way we organize our economic and social life on Earth. I advise the leadership of the European Union and the People's Republic of China, and we worked on plans in both of those regions. The European plan to address climate change is called Smart Europe. The plan we've developed and helped to develop with China is called China Internet Plus. Let me explain. The great economic paradigm shifts in history occur when three revolutions come together and change the way we organize life. New communication technologies to more efficiently manage our economic activity, new sources of energy to more efficiently power our economic activity, new modes of mobility and transport to more efficiently move our economic activity. So when communication revolutions join with new energy regimes and new modes of mobility, it changes the way society organizes itself, from agriculture to industrial production and consumption. So this second industrial revolution of the 20th century has taken us to climate change, centralized telecommunication, converging with fossil fuel and nuclear energy, converging with internal combustion engine transport based on those fossil fuel energies. We now know that that second industrial revolution, infrastructure, communication, energy, and mobility, has peaked in its productivity. We're seeing a loss of productivity, a loss of business opportunity, a loss of employment, and more importantly, that infrastructure is taking us into climate change in real time. In Europe and China, we have taken a look at this and said we need a third industrial revolution, a new convergence of communication, energy, and mobility that will change the way we produce our food, the way we organize our factories, the way we transport ourselves in our cities. And here's what this is. We need a digital revolution. We need to take the communication internet, which we already use. It's been a revolution in communication. Everyone has their cell phone. We need to converge that communication internet with a renewable energy internet and either use it off-grid or share it back on an energy internet that operates exactly like the communication internet we're using now. And then we need to take those two internets and converge them with a mobility internet made up of electric and fuel cell vehicles powered by solar and wind electricity. The vehicles, they should be shared in car-sharing services. There's no reason why the whole world can't be off fossil fuels in 25 years from now. The cost of solar and wind is plummeting. It's already almost on parity and sometimes cheaper than fossil fuels and nuclear. Even if you're in a remote village in the Amazon, you're going to be able to produce your own solar and wind and then share what you don't need across an energy internet across continents. With transport, if we start sharing our vehicles, for every vehicle we share in these car-sharing services, we're eliminating 15 vehicles. That means the 1 billion vehicles that are moving us toward climate change, we're going to probably get rid of 800 million of them in the next 3 generations. The car companies know this with car sharing. If the remaining 200 million vehicles are electric, fuel cell, operated by solar and wind electricity, and the marginal cost of that solar and wind is free because the sun doesn't send you a bill, and the wind doesn't send you a bill, we're going to eliminate a lot of the problems in transport. This affects agriculture because in agriculture, energy is a major player. Agriculture uses a huge amount of electricity and energy and fossil fuels. Irrigating those agricultural lands. That irrigation requires electricity to pump that water into the system. Then the tractors, the machinery, use fossil fuel energy. And then the fertilizers and pesticides are made out of fossil fuels and emit nitrous oxide, etc. And then you have to store all of that food production and then send it to the market and then to the consumer. So Agricultural supply chains are a huge player in moving us to climate change. If we can move to this new infrastructure, what we've designed as Smart Europe, China Internet Plus, we can do this in the rest of the world. Within 25, 30 years, we ought to have in every community and region an infrastructure where any of us can take advantage of a connected communication internet, renewable energy internet, and a driverless mobility internet, all operated by clean, renewable energies. And nowhere will this be more important than in agriculture, where we can really get off the climate change wagon. We can begin to take some control over our food priorities and our diet and our production of food and our consumption of food and our recycling of waste. The way we have to do it is region to region and community to community. What we have learned in Europe and in China, because we are employing these transformations on the ground in many regions now, is that the local communities and regions have to take control in the age of resilience and began to develop a roadmap to transform their regions into this third industrial revolution infrastructure of digital communication internet, digital energy internet, digital mobility internet, Internet of Things platform. The third industrial revolution infrastructure is very interesting architecturally. Anyone that's been on the internet knows the internet's designed to be distributed, not centralized. It works best if it's open and transparent and not closed with intellectual property, because you want the network effect. So this third industrial revolution infrastructure is so different than the second industrial revolution infrastructure of the 20th century, which was centralized, top-down, and vertically integrated, and you had a handful of global corporations pretty well deciding the fate of our communities. So in Europe and now in China, regions and communities are beginning to develop roadmaps, and agriculture is an absolute centerpiece to these roadmaps, but so is changes in our industrial way of life and our mobility as well. So when it comes to cattle and the livestock industry and the tremendous burden they're placing on the planet because of their key role in climate change and global warming emissions, we're now over the line. And the idea that we're going to double meat production between now and 2050, this is just unsustainable. This is going to have to give. We have to have a robust conversation in every community around the world on how we began to address the issue of moving down the food chain to a more plant diet, and we can get all the protein we need out of plants. This is one of the big misconceptions. How do you get protein? There's plenty of protein in plants. We need to have a conversation in every community, in every region of the world, on how we began to change our diets, move down the food chain, and we're going to have to take a look at regulations and taxing the beef industry and the livestock industry. My gosh, we have regulations in place, we have taxes in place dealing with factories, and we have taxes and regulations in place to make sure that they reduce their emissions. We have all sorts of regulatory protocols and taxes in place on transportation to make sure we reduce those global warming emissions. We have it with buildings. We have it with everything else except food. So I'm waiting for some community, some city, some region, some country to open this floodgates and begin to say we now need to educate ourselves about how our diet is taking us to an abyss with climate change. And it's the responsible behavior to come together and take a look at regulatory protocols, taxes that can inform people of the need to shift the diet and move down the food chain. So the question is this. We have regulations and taxes and protocols that will help us reduce our emissions of global warming gases in factories, in buildings, in communities, in transportation logistics, virtually every field except when it comes to agriculture, which is astounding to me. And that's one of the major contributors to global warming gases. It's the elephant in the room. So the issue is raising the story. Because once we raise the story, people begin to see, oh my gosh, we do have to tend to this as well. We can begin to modify our diet. We can begin to address the impact that cattle and livestock have on global warming. This is the contribution I can feel I can make. But first they need to know the story. This narrative has to be shared. We have a World Wide Web. We should be able to get this narrative out within a matter of months all over the world. Then it's up to the people to talk to their elected officials, their local business leaders, their civil society organizations, and there needs to be a robust campaigning, if you will, activist campaigning that's at least as robust as the campaigning we've done around transport and around buildings and around saving our ecosystems in other ways. This is a #1 priority. This is a next step in taking responsibility for our communities, our planet, our biosphere, our fellow species. And if we don't do this, we're going to lose that precious small amount of time we have left to create resilient communities against a climate change world that is emerging fast. In Europe and China, there's a lot of initiatives now moving on how we can begin to address climate change at every level, including agriculture. And in Europe, for example, ecological agriculture has become the sine qua non of the future of agriculture. It's everywhere. All over Europe, there is a transition going from chemical-based agriculture to ecological agriculture. As you know, Europe has largely said no to GMOs, but not to marker-assisted selection, which is another way to use the new life sciences and the genetic knowledge, but in a more informative way. So Europe is really moving in every region of Europe toward a more ecological agriculture, and it's becoming part of the dietary preference of consumers as well, which is important. In China, which is interesting, China's involved in a program that has gotten no attention around the world. I work with the leadership in China. 23%, I think it is, of all the marginal agricultural land, they're rewilding. We have to do this in every community around the world. So in the Anthropocene, we will not have a global authority telling us all what to do. We each have to take responsibility in our communities for the 19 kilometers of the biosphere we live in. We have to take each of our regions and turn them into a biosphere commons. They have to be rewilded. The agricultural land has to move to ecological agriculture. We have to have them all equipped with solar and wind technologies. All of this can be done. We know this because in the 3 test regions in Europe, this is happening. Look at Haute-de-France. This is the industrial region of northern France, the old mining region, steel, auto, coal. This is a region that was in bad shape. 5 years later, this is won the award as the entrepreneurial region of all the 350 regions of Europe. Thousands of new jobs. The grandchildren of miners have been retrained to retrofit buildings and put solar panels on. We have 1,000 or so projects now that have moved us toward this third industrial revolution plan. Jobs, new businesses, and esprit de corps. How did it happen? They rolled up their sleeves and they said, we're not going to wait for someone to tell us what to do. We're going to do it ourselves. If the Rust Belt of northern France can do this, and now the petrochemical complex of Rotterdam to The Hague, every region in the world can do this. Can change our way we operate in terms of our agricultural regions, our industrial production, and the way we consume the goods and services that we produce. This can be done everywhere. I'm guardedly hopeful we can make this transformation, but I think this is an uphill climb. We've wasted way too much time. We now should be in an emergency situation, as my wife says, and move in every region and community. Here's why I'm guardedly hopeful. I'm seeing among a younger generation a shift in how they identify themselves on this planet. You know, I grew up, and generations before me, in a geopolitical world, the nation state. And we all saw ourselves as autonomous beings, that we wanted to be self-sufficient and independent and not beholden to others. And as citizens, sovereign citizens of countries, we compete with other sovereign citizens for scarce resources in the marketplace, zero-sum game. Our nation states represent us in the world. They compete with other nations in the marketplace or the battlefield to secure resources in a scarce world. This is the world we grew up in. So what I say to folks is, can anyone tell us how we address climate change, bring the human race together, see ourselves as integral part of an evolutionary family that involves all of our fellow species with that worldview? Can't be done. We've got young people coming home with biosphere consciousness all over the world. And I'll give you an example. We have young people asking, where did the hamburger come from on the plate? This is happening, 14-year-olds. They're asking their parents, did this come from a rainforest? did they have to burn those trees in that tropical rainforest to get 6 inches of topsoil to graze that cow so I could eat that hamburger. And the kids connect the dots. They understand if those trees are burned to get the 6 inches of topsoil to graze the cow for the hamburger, there's rare species of animals life that only live in that particular tropical rainforest, they go extinct. And then if the trees are not there, they're burned so that you can have the soil for the hamburger, those trees aren't absorbing CO2 from industrial emissions. That means some farmer can't feed her children 10,000 miles away from this hamburger because she's living in a subsistence agricultural region that has spring floods, summer droughts, wildfires, and she can't grow enough food for her family because of the hamburger. These kids are connecting the dots, ecological footprint. It's not academic. What they are learning, and this is the bittersweet story of climate change. It's teaching us that we all live in a planet that's totally interconnected. We're not autonomous agents. We all rely on all of the connections that tie us to the lithosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the circadian rhythms of this earth. And so what the kids are learning is that everything we do literally has some impact on another human, another family, another creature, a species, or the ecosystems we live in. This is biosphere consciousness. This is what's going to take us to the next era in history, because if we can understand that the biosphere is our indivisible community and that our well-being depends on the well-being of our fellow creatures and the planet we live in, we may be able to weather the storm of climate change. We'll be in a different world, the Anthropocene, a more resilient world, and we'll start to learn how to live in a harmonious way with this beautiful earth that we've been given. It takes leadership. It takes some community to step forward and say, enough, we are going to make a transformation into a new economic paradigm in history that allow us to create a more sustainable, ecological, and just society. So when Chancellor Merkel became Chancellor of Germany, she asked me to come to Berlin in the first couple of weeks of her new government to help her address the question of how to move the German economy and create jobs. And the first thing I asked the new chancellor is, I said, how do you move the German economy and create jobs when your businesses are plugged into a 20th century infrastructure of centralized telecommunication, fossil fuel nuclear power, internal combustion, road, rail, water, and air transport? So I said, you can have market reforms, labor reforms, fiscal reforms, and you can stimulate 1 million Steve Jobs. It won't make any difference if they're plugged in their businesses to this old infrastructure of centralized telecommunication, fossil fuel nuclear power, internal combustion transport, because that infrastructure not only peaked in its productivity, it's now taking us to climate change. It's taking us to global warming emissions and the age of the Anthropocene. So on that first day, we discussed the third industrial revolution, a new convergence of communication, energy, and mobility that could take Germany into a new sustainable era. And that third industrial revolution is the coming together of the communication internet. We all have our smartphones. And that communication internet, connecting it to a digital renewable energy internet in Germany, and then share what they don't use back on an energy internet, just like we share information, news, and entertainment on the communication internet, same digital technology. Then those two internets, the communication internet and the energy internet for renewables, they converge with a digitalized, automated transportation internet operated by your own solar and wind electricity. And so this is the revolution we have to have. Germany said, the chancellor said, yes, we will have this revolution in Germany. Sigmar Gabriel, a good friend of mine, who is the vice chancellor, moved forward with the energy plan with the chancellor. And Frank Steinmeier, the former foreign minister, is now the president of Germany. But the regions did it, the communities did it, the neighborhoods did it. This is power to the people. Literally and figuratively, power is now in the hands of people in their communities, and now they can share on an energy internet across communities, across countries, and eventually across Eurasia on a Eurasia energy internet. This is a lateral power revolution, not just for energy, but it means every community is going to be responsible for its own destiny, and equally important, an ecologically sustainable world. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to learn how to be as sufficient as we can locally and regionally with our food production, storage, and use. We're going to have to be more ecological because we're going to have to get off of fossil fuel-based energies on the farm That means we're going to have to get off of those petrochemical fertilizers, the petrochemical pesticides. All of the electricity we use can no longer come from fossil fuels to pump the irrigation, the water, and run the machinery. The distribution system to get all the food to local markets has to be in vehicles that are solar and wind-generated electric vehicles. All of this has to happen. Every region has to become as self-sufficient as possible, but they're not going to be 100% self-sufficient. So they have to cross-border, not just physically, but virtually, where they can begin to work in both realms, virtually and physically, to help share surpluses against lulls and help each other out in a lateral, globalized world in the 21st century. That's the name of the future for everybody. So there will be times when one region will have to call on another region. We're not going to end trade. We're not going to end. There will still be products, food products, is sent from one region to another. We're going to have to understand that each region has to be self-sufficient as best they can. No region can be 100% self-sufficient in their food or in their other requirements. We're still going to require trade and commerce. It's going to be localized, not globalized. That means regions are already starting to work with other regions all over the world because they can work virtually and physically. So this digital third industrial revolution is power to the people across every domain. We can potentially democratize economic life. It won't be a utopia, but we can democratize economic life and be more resilient locally and more collaborative globally. And this can be done tomorrow morning. If we can do it in these 3 regions in Europe, and this can be done anywhere in the world. We're beginning to see an important conversation emerge now in Europe and in China, and I work in both places, on how to begin changing our diet. There is the dawning realization we cannot continue to have a more meat-oriented diet. I mean, we see the numbers. I mean, 36% of our agricultural land is now, all over the world, is growing feed grain for animals, not food grain for people. And the projections are that we will double our meat production and consumption by 2050, which means over half of all the agricultural land left is going to be growing feed grain for animals, so the very wealthy can eat high up on that food chain, and it's not tenable because everyone else will have no access to land to grow food for their families. This conversation has begun in the European Union and the People's Republic of China. And it's not just a conversation. There is a heady discussion on how we begin to lay out this narrative about changing our dietary habits, reducing our beef and meat consumption, creating more ecological-based agriculture, taking responsibility for our 19 kilometers of the biosphere in each region and community. This conversation has moved to deployment. So there is a lot of not just theory, but now practice emerging in Europe and China. The rest of the world is far behind.